Welcome back, everyone, to the Seaweed Mini Workshop 2022 on focus on Nereocystis. This module and the next, I'll be talking about this wonderful iconic seaweed. Some of you are familiar with it, either seeing the beds offshore or seeing them washed ashore. This is a kelp that's lives from Alaska all the way almost to Point Conception. In fact, it's gone over the tip of Point Conception into the northernmost Channel Islands, San Miguel Island. That is its distribution. But what I want to do is tell you a story. I want to tell you a story about how this kelp got its name. In the herbarium, one of our major tools for working with specimens, working with species, is nomenclature. Nomenclature is the name game, how we name seaweeds, plants, animals, according to the laws of botanical nomenclature or zoological nomenclature. So I'm going to give you a little bit of story on botanical nomenclature and how it works for us. Nomenclature is a confluence of exploring and explorers, of botanists, of history, and of opinion. It's not as much a science as it is sort of a legalistic pursuit of how to name something and keep that name through time, even as our awareness of it changes. So we may have different opinions about that species, and we need to change the name to reflect that opinion. So it's a name game, and it involves everything. It's a very integrative sport, as you will soon see. And then in the next module, I'll be talking more about Nereocystis, the species, and its ecology. But let's talk names. Here is a kelp forest, a Nereocystis kelp forest. And here is the beginning of my own personal story with Nereocystis. I participated in 1987 on a cruise through the Aleutian Islands from Attu Island all the way back to the Alaska Peninsula. And we were on a diving expedition to try to understand the interaction between otters and urchins and kelps. So we were doing underwater work to see how islands with otters and without otters were different because of the presence of otters, that keystone predator. Well, in the course of this expedition, I was looking for Nereocystis because I knew it was reported from the Shumagan Islands here, but I wondered if, in fact, its range was longer. If we looked, we could find that it had gone further west than the Shumagan Islands. And in fact, yes, here we found where this red star is on Umnak Island, a huge bed of Nereocystis. And it was the last one we saw as we traveled the rest of the chain. We saw drift specimens all the way out to Attu Island, but this was the last living kelp bed. So that got me interested in the whole history of Nereocystis and how we came to know it. The story begins with George Wilhelm Steller, who was a naturalist on Bering's Great Northern Expedition in the mid-1700s. So this is a stamp, shows the course of Bering expedition from Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia. The first expedition just followed this trajectory all the way to Alaska and then back again. So Steller was the naturalist on this expedition. He was a German doctor, physician, who moved to Russia to join the Imperial Academy of Sciences. Germany and Russia were both powerhouses of natural history and exploration. And many, as you will see, Germans worked with Russians to discover what was happening in Alaska all the way across the chain to Russia. So on the second voyage to Kamchatka, they spent a winter and then sailed to Alaska. Steller accompanied them and described 6 new species as a result of this trip, including the sea cow, which is now extinct, and that is a story unto itself, and the Steller's jay, which lives at my house. So Steller collected the first specimen of Nereocystis and sent it to this botanist, Johann Georg Gmelin. Gmelin was also a German physician who moved to St. Petersburg and served as academic support for Bering's voyages. He dealt with specimens in botany, herpetology, and geology and entomology. So he was a naturalist. This is the specimen he received from Steller. Just this, a portion of the stipe. But he wrote it up in Latin, a description, and you can see Steller's name here as the one who collected it. It was floating. And he collected it on the shores of Kamchatka. At the time of Gmelin in the early 1700s, in the mid 1700s, there were very few seaweed genus names, and he chose the name ulva out of 5 names available, Linnaean names. So he chose the name ulva for the genus, and then he wanted to describe what the specimen looked like to him in the species name. He named it Priapus after the god of fertility, Roman god of fertility. And if you look closely at this picture, you'll see the resemblance between the specimen and the god. So the name he gave was Ulva Priapus Gmelin. The next chapter in this history was in the hands of Mertens, Carl Heinrich Mertens. Filius, F stands here for Filius, because he was the son of another botanist named Mertens, who was very eminent in Germany. Mellens, too, was a physician who moved from Germany to St. Petersburg and joined Captain Luetke's expedition to Alaska on the ship Seniavin. This was a very famous voyage, and you'll see why, especially famous for seaweeds. Also aboard on that ship was Alexander Postels, who was an Estonian geologist, mineralogist, and a very, very accomplished artist. So he sketched the specimens that were collected on the expedition from life, rather than like Gmelin had to deal with something that was very, very dead. This expedition reached Sitka, Alaska, where Mertens witnessed a full-blown Nereocystis kelp bed. And he also saw how the native people there used the kelp. They used it as the bulb to bail their bidarkas, their kayaks. They used the stipe as fishing line. It was very much part of their culture. And he wrote about this in German here. You can see he named it, he chose a different genus name, Fucus, which is a name that many of the kelps were originally named. In fact, many seaweeds were named Fucus. And he named the species after the captain of the ship. So his first specimens were from Sitka, Alaska. But very significantly, this German description was translated into English by William Henry Harvey, another eminent Irish phycologist. And for that reason, the English-speaking world became aware of Nereocystis as well, and of how it was used in Sitka by the native people. So Alexander Postels, the artist, teamed up with Franz Josef Ruprecht. These were both Austrian, also working with the Russians. Both of them were on the Seniavin. So Ruprecht was the botanist working with the artist. And this is a picture of the frontispiece of their very, very famous book, The Illustrations of the Seaweeds. So you can see here a split view of the terrestrial and the submarine. Here are the Russian soldiers helping the collectors, carrying their collections, and a reconstruction by Postels of the seaweed forest beneath. So this is one of the lithographs by Postels of Postelsia palmiformis, a new genus named after Postels, and another iconic seaweed in the wave-swept intertidal of California. Ruprecht was honored with the name and other names as well. Cryptoplura ruprechtiana, a beautiful red seaweed that's very, very common in Northern California and further north. Can I go back? Let's see. No. Let me just go back a second to underline the name. Oh, I don't have to go back. They named, Postels and Ruprecht named the species a new genus. They took it out of Fucus because it was so unique and named it Nereocystis, the bladder of the water sprite. Romantic name. And they retained the species name. They just transferred Fucus luetkeana to Nereocystis luetkeana. Here they've given credit to Mertens, who found the first specimen, and then we append their name, Postels and Ruprecht, as the people who transferred it to Nereocystis. And these two workers not only illustrated the plant beautifully, both morphologically in form and anatomically, but they also gave a very, very detailed description in Latin of this plant. So some of you may recognize Nereocystis luetkeana is the current name, but the story is not over. This is 1840. Let's keep going. 1901, another botanist comes on board here, D'Alton Saunders. D'Alton Saunders was from South Dakota, and he worked in agriculture, but he spent 2 years in California, 1895 to 1896, mostly in Monterey and San Pedro. But he got the opportunity to join the Harriman expedition, which was a major expedition to understand the flora of Alaska. So he went to Alaska in 1899, and he named and illustrated many species. And he too saw Nereocystis and noted that it was abundant from Puget Sound all the way to the Shumagon Islands. So a lot more was known about this plant by the turn of the 20th century. He also gives a concise description of the plant, and then he references Mertens. Mertens' statement, copied by Harvey, speaking of the stipes, they're said to be 45 fathoms long. Probably not true, he says, because he'd seen them on the California, Oregon, and Washington coasts and knew that they weren't quite as long as that. So here's someone who has experience in California who is comparing his observations with the earlier Alaskan observations. Then he goes on to say, Mellon's figures and description of Ulva priapus leave no doubt as to the identity of his plant, although he only had an imperfect stipe. As his description antedates Mertens by some 60 years, it seems best to the writer to reinstate the name given by him. So D'Alton Saunders said, Mertens, you ignored Gmelin. Gmelin had this in hand, and even though it was just a portion of the stipe, it clearly couldn't be anything else but Nereocystis. So D'Alton Saunders accepted the genus name of Mertens, of Postels and Ruprecht, Nereocystis, but he accepted Gmelin's species name and transferred priapus into Nereocystis. So here he gives Mellon credit for the first collection, and then his name is appended as the one who transferred it to the genus Nereocystis, 1901. Next chapter in the story, some familiar faces. Setchell and Gardner are the foundation of the seaweed collection at UC. Remember, Setchell was the first director of the herbarium, and both of these men worked together to found our collection and also to give the basis for our knowledge of California, Washington, and Alaska's seaweeds. Setchell was educated at Yale and Harvard, and he taught after he graduated at Yale until he was recruited to Berkeley in 1895. He was only 31 years old at that time, and he became the director and curator. He was a phycologist. He was a mycologist studying fungi. He was a biogeographer, an ethnobotanist, and a geneticist, and an incredible collector and a networker. He visited many European herbaria, brought back specimens that have greatly enriched our collection. He was a participant in Bohemian Grove revels, so he was also a bon homme, and as I say, an incredible networker. Gardner was a teacher in Whidbey Island, Washington, who asked Setchell to help him ID some Washingtonian seaweeds, and soon joined Setchell at UC, and they collaborated together. Gardner was an incredible microscopist, incredible collector, and the two of them together were synergistic. And we have thousands of their collections, all very precious. So here's what Setchell and Gardner said in 1925, about 24 years after Saunders. They accepted Postel's and Ruprecht's name. And this is the reason. It's one of our largest and most striking seaweeds. We are extremely disinclined to adopt the binomial Nereocystis priapus, although by the process of exclusion, its application to our plant may seem to be extremely plausible. The ulva priapus melon was neither well described nor convincingly illustrated. Its locality is in doubt. Probably it's either Nereocystis or Pelagophycus, and more probably the former than the latter, but we have neither seen nor heard of anything of the type specimen, the original specimen that Mellon had in hand. So what he's saying here is the earliest name is usually the name that's accepted, but he wants to make an exception here. Gmellin's name is the earliest name, but he feels that Gmelin didn't have enough information to base his conclusion on, and that Mertens had much better feeling for the organism, had the entire organism, and illustrated it much more profusely. So Setchell and Gardner said, we're going to go against the law of priority. That is, we're not going to choose the earliest name, which is a nomenclatural law. We're going to choose this name. And I think partly because maybe people were a little bit offended by the name Priapus, or maybe because Setchell and Gardner by this time had gained so much clout, authority, and credibility that this is the name that we use now, Nereocystis luetkeana, originally described by Mertens, transferred to Nereocystis by Postels and Ruprecht. So here is the name as we know it now. Here are some specimens from our herbarium that show you can make a specimen. These are juveniles, of course, beautiful in their own right. So let me give you a quiz, a nomenclature quiz. Here are a couple names. Who originally described this species here? Of course, the answer is Linnaeus. It was described This is Macrocystis, our giant kelp. It was described as Fucus pyriferus by Linnaeus back in 1771, a contemporary of Gmelin. It was transferred by C. Agard, a Swedish phycologist, into the genus Macrocystis in 1820. So who originally described the species? Linnaeus. Another quiz about Macrocystis. Two names apply to one species. Which is the valid name? Both Macrocystis pyrifera, Macrocystis integrifolia have been reported, but it turns out that they're actually the same species. By the law of priority, which one is the valid name? It's Macrocystis pyrifera. Not only is the original name older, but even the combination is older than Macrocystis borii, 1826. So I hope that you get a flavor for these names. They're not arbitrary. They're not just pretty. They have a long history that involves places and people and history, and they're a record of our interaction with the natural world. So those who keep track of names and the history and all the old literature are extremely important to our understanding of what our species are and where their names will go as we learn more about them.